We look at the impact of poverty on children and more specifically a lack of food. Now joining us in the studio is agricultural economist Dr. Tracy Ledger. She's also the author of An Empty Plate, a well-researched account of South Africa's hunger problem. Dr. Ledger, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Good evening.
Now, about 53 kids under the age of 5 die in South Africa every single day, and about 3/4 of them don't actually see their first birthdays. Now, there's an argument that they could be dying as a result of natural causes, but malnutrition is the key driver of infant mortality in South Africa. How did it get to this point? What's the cause of this? Why is this the case?
Look, I think that there are many ways in which malnutrition manifests itself in child mortality. So one of the things is that somewhere between about 5,000 and 7,000 children a year in this country die outright from hunger. Literally, they die of starvation. But there are many, many more children whose health is compromised because they're not getting adequate nutrition. So 1 in 4 children in South Africa is classified as stunted, which means that their development has been very severely impacted by poor nutrition.
Okay. Now, Tracy, the child support in South Africa, we currently stands at 380 rand. That equates to 12 rand a day. Do these grants provide relief and better nutritional requirements for children?
Look, I think it's quite clear that the child support grant has prevented many, many, many more children from starving to death. But it is not really a way to feed children. If we have a look at just one food item, so a child under the age of 5 should have half a litre of milk or mass every day, it would cost more than half of the monthly childcare grant just to provide a child with that level of nutrition. So yes, the childcare grants are stopping children from starving to death, but they are not doing very much in the way of adequate nutrition for children.
And what's the extent of this crisis? Just how prevalent is it in South Africa?
Well, as I said, you know, we've got 1 in 4 children classified as stunted. Stats SA's latest research has found that only 23% of children under the age of 3 in South Africa meet the minimum nutritional requirements, which means that almost 80% of children don't meet minimum nutritional requirements. And what we see that this means that children's cognitive development is damaged. They can't learn in school. They're much more predisposed to being obese as adults. They're more predisposed to things like diabetes and poor health. And there's a strong scientific link as well between childhood malnutrition and an increased propensity for violence in adults through permanent damage to the brain's impulse control. So childhood malnutrition, which affects probably somewhere between half and 2/3 of all of our children, is one of the most important factors that can explain our high levels of violence.
And one may also argue that there's a fine line between hunger and malnutrition. What is the difference between those two narratives?
Well, hunger is something you might self-identify with, that you feel hunger, but malnutrition means that your body is not getting enough of the nutrients that it needs in order to develop and grow properly. So sometimes people are not hungry because they're getting a lot of calories in, but those calories have actually not got any nutrition in them. So what you see in some of the surveys is you'll see children that are both stunted and obese. And that just talks to the incredible low quality of their diet. And the reason for that is because it's expensive to eat a nutritionally balanced and nutritionally adequate diet.
Yeah, indeed. Now, and we also have to center our discussions around our broken food system, and we have to talk about what the true cost of food is to South Africa and what solutions are at our disposal to address the health concerns of children in our country.
Yeah, I think we need to understand that this really is a social crisis, that we cannot continue in a situation where children cannot learn in school. Children are becoming sick from hunger, they're dying from hunger. There's a long-term huge social cost for everyone. But we also seem to have forgotten that there's a constitutionally guaranteed right to food. Section 27 of the Constitution guarantees the right to food for everyone, and Section 28 of the Constitution further guarantees the right to food for children. But government and policy seems to act as if the way in which people must access food is only through the markets, and that if you're too poor to be able to eat, well, that's too bad. But we don't look at any of the other Section 27 rights like that. We don't say, well, if people can't afford water, too bad. We understand that there's an obligation to provide the basics of life: water, shelter, housing, healthcare, education. But for some reason, we seem to have forgotten about food. But food is at the heart of some of the most serious and pressing social problems that we've got in this country.
And you're, in your book, you're actually condemning how supermarkets are ripping us off. Who's right? I mean, whose prerogative is it to provide food security in South Africa? Are you probably suggesting that the government is failing our children in these particular instances?
Yes, I think that what has happened is that we've handed over a basic right of life. If you don't eat, you die. It's not like TV sets or shoes or whatever. If you don't eat, you die. And what we've done is we've handed over the responsibility for providing this basic of foodstuff to the profit-making private sector. There's no constitutionally guaranteed right to make a profit, but there is a constitutionally guaranteed right to food. And once again, we wouldn't do that with anything else. There'd be a huge national outcry if we handed over water, for example, to private profit-making companies and say, well, you know, knock yourselves out, make a profit. If you can't afford it, you can't have it. But we've done exactly that with food. So I think it's the way in which we've envisaged food as a commodity. It's much more than a commodity. It's the stuff of life. If you don't eat, you die.
Absolutely. And you know, some of the consequences include women prostituting themselves just to provide for their children. How dire is this?
I think that a lot of people don't understand how bad the situation is and the lengths that people are going to have to try and feed themselves and to feed their families. And these things will tear our social fabric apart. I mean, how much longer do we think we can hold things together while millions and millions of people are suffering like this? And people are just don't seem to be paying any attention. I don't think any of us would watch a child under our care starve to death while we could do anything about it. So why is it so different just because it's someone else's child?
What can we do about this?
I think we need to raise awareness of the situation and understand that this is not just some little malnutrition problem that we can fix with a couple of school feeding schemes. We need to understand the depth and the severity of the problem, and it needs to get onto the political agenda. We need to stop acting as if this is a problem that will be solved in 20 years' time when we've addressed unemployment or poverty. It doesn't help to say that people are hungry because they're poor and unemployed. That's obvious, but it's not helpful. People are not going to postpone their hunger until they've got a job. We need to do something about it now. And that means it needs to be prioritized on the political agenda, and it isn't. It's not a priority at all.
Yeah, and speaking of political agenda, are we justified in expecting government to be providing food security? Because some may argue that most of millions of South Africans don't actually have the means of providing food.
Well, exactly, but millions of South Africans don't have the means of providing all sorts of things. We don't say if you can't afford education, you can't have it. If you can't afford healthcare, you can't have it. Water, housing. We understand that there are long-term benefits for everyone in building a different and more inclusive society. Now, the children that are suffering the negative effects of hunger and are dying of hunger and living in homes damaged by domestic violence because of hunger are the vast majority, almost all of them, are poor black children. So how can we build a more inclusive and equitable society while we keep subjecting children to this kind of future simply because they don't have enough to eat? And on the other hand, this is quite an easy problem to solve. South Africa already produces enough food for everyone who lives here. It's a question of accessing food. And all of us suffer the long-term negative impacts of this. We can't build an inclusive society. We can't build an inclusive economy while children cannot learn in school. More than a quarter of our disease burden in this country, public sector disease burden, comes from non-communicable diseases that are the direct result of poor nutrition. Our world-class levels of violence in large part can be traced back to poor levels of nutrition. So we can't just say, okay, just because I'm not hungry, it isn't my problem. It is our problem. It's everyone's problem.
Okay, Dr. Ledger, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. That is agricultural economist Dr. Tracy Ledger. She's also the author of An Empty Plate, a well-researched account of South Africa's hunger problem. All right, we have more sport after the break.